All right, guys, so this week we're going to start animals, and we're going to have one PowerPoint today on just an introduction to animals and how they're classified, things that unite animals, ways that we terminology that we use for the body parts, and then we'll have another PowerPoint where we talk about invertebrates, and then next week we'll talk about vertebrates. So, all animals are heterotrophic by ingestion, so they have to eat. They can't make their own food like plants. They can't absorb it like fungi do. They actually have to eat their food. They are eukaryotic, obviously, and they are multicellular. So, as opposed to, say, a protist that might be eating something to get nutrition, they are multicellular. And we have tissues, and those are just groups of cells that work together to serve a common function. And we are the only organisms that have nerve and muscle cells. We also are not supported by a cell wall, and we have proteins that help support our cells that form sort of like an internal skeleton inside all of your cells. And a protein like that would be collagen. So the top picture on this slide has a heart with all of the muscle cells taken off of it, and what's left is the collagen scaffold. Most animals reproduce sexually and are diploid, which means they have two sets of chromosomes. And they all go through this process called gastrulation. So you have the zygote that's formed after fertilization, and it's going to go through about 100 cell divisions until it looks like this little hollow ball of cells on the left called a blastula. And then it actually folds over on itself, and that's what forms all of your tissue layers: the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm, which we'll talk more about later. So I said animals reproduce sexually most of the time. There are some exceptions. So for instance, a starfish can do regeneration. They can regrow a limb. Hydra and jellyfish can do budding, and that's where you have the juvenile growing from the adult, and then eventually once it gets large enough they'll separate. And then we have fragmentation, which in my opinion is the weirdest thing. Flatworms can do regeneration. You could cut up any part of the flatworm and it would regrow into a new worm. So that's different from regeneration because animals that do regeneration can only regrow certain body parts. But if you were to sever some of the main parts like the brain, if they have one, their nervous system or their heart or anything like that, that part would not regrow, they would just die. Flatworms are unique in that you could cut the tail off and it would grow a new head. Animals also have Hox genes that determine their body plan from front to back. Not all of them have what's called cephalization, where they have a head and they have a clear front and back. Some are asymmetrical. Others have radial symmetry, so they're round. But I would say most animals are going to have bilateral symmetry, and that means they have cephalization, or they have a head. They have a top and a bottom, a dorsal and ventral side, and they have an anterior and posterior end. So they have a head and a tail. So like I said, gastrulation is going to lead to germ layers. The ectoderm is the outermost layer, and it also gives rise to the nervous system, in addition to the outer covering. The endoderm is the innermost layer, and that's going to give rise to a lot of the gut cavity. Some animals only have 2 layers, so that's called diploblastic, and that's what you see in cnidarians. And cnidarians are jellyfish. Animals that have 3 tissue layers are triploblastic, and they have a mesoderm that makes up their muscles and some of the other internal organs. Additionally, most triploblastic animals are going to have what's called a coelom. And a coelom is a fluid or air-filled space between the organs and your outer body covering, and it helps protect them. So true coelomates include earthworms. They're true coelomates because the mesoderm is what makes up both sides, the internal and external part of the coelom. Then you have pseudocoelomates, pseudo meaning fake. This includes roundworms, and they're typically parasitic. It's called a pseudocoelom because it's made up of the endo and the mesoderm. It's not a true coelom unless it's lined on both sides with the mesoderm. Acoelomates do not have a coelom, and that includes flatworms. So we're coelomates, and anything in blue on this diagram is the fluid-filled cavity. So you have a fluid-filled cavity around all of your digestive organs. You also have a fluid-filled cavity around your heart, and you have fluid-filled cavities around your lungs to help protect them. So animals can be put into two categories based on what develops first, whether it's their mouth or their anus. And this will make more sense when we get to the next picture. But once they go through gastrulation, that blastula folds over on itself, then you have an opening. That's the blastopore. And that little opening can either be the mouth or the anus. In protostomes, it's going to be the mouth, and in deuterostomes, it will be the anus. And then the other part forms. So you can see here we have on the left in green, that's the protostome, and then on the right, it's still kind of green, isn't it? In the teal bluish color, that's the deuterostome. So with the protostome, you have the mouth developing first, the anus forms later, and in the deuterostome, the anus forms first, the mouth forms later. And the reason why we've gone over all these terms is so that you understand the phylogeny of animals. So let me get my pen out. The first thing we'll do is we'll look at, hello pen. We'll look at sponges. They're asymmetrical, and they don't have any tissues. Okay, all the rest of these guys are going to have tissues. And notice over here we have chordates. That's us. Okay, it includes some ancestral chordates like lancelets that are very simple, but it also includes vertebrates, animals with a backbone. And we can sort of expand that phylogeny later. We'll look at vertebrates next week. But right now we're just looking at invertebrates. So then we split them off. Invertebrates, animals that don't have a backbone, that have radial symmetry include cnidarians. And then everybody else is going to have bilateral symmetry, and they're going to have a head. And you might be thinking, well, what about starfish? They acquired radial symmetry later. It's kind of an anomaly, but for the rest of these guys, they're going to be, they'll have cephalization and they'll have a head. And we've separated them out next by protostome and deuterostome. So we are deuterostomes, you'll notice. So that means the anus forms first during embryologic development. So our protostomes include flatworms, earthworms, mollusks, roundworms, which are mostly parasitic, arthropods, which includes insects, spiders, and crustaceans. This is a huge group. And then you have echinoderms, which includes the sea stars. And last we have chordates. So echinoderms are our closest ancestor because they're also deuterostomes, along with lanceolate, and other chordates. All right, short and sweet. One more PowerPoint for the day on invertebrates, and then you guys will have a virtual lab.